The night was warm and still, the kind of night where the air outside wrapped around you like a soft blanket. But inside the HOA banquet hall, everything sparkled with fake smiles and expensive perfume. Golden lights shimmered on polished floors. The tables were covered with snow-white cloths, and crystal glasses reflected the chandelier like fire trapped in glass. Laughter floated from one corner to another, bouncing off the tall walls as board members and wealthy homeowners greeted each other. Like they were kings and queens, every handshake was rehearsed, every smile was practiced, every laugh was fake but loud enough to fill the room. It was supposed to be a perfect night, the night when the HOA would secure the biggest deal in their history. A deal that promised new buildings, more power, more control, and of course, more money. They had dressed for power, spoke like they owned the world, and no one in that glowing room thought anything could go wrong. But in the corner, away from the golden tables and loud laughter, sat a man no one paid attention to. His suit was neat and clean, his shoes polished, his posture straight, but his eyes were down, silent, calm, and distant. He was deaf, and for most of them, invisible. He sat at the farthest table, next to the tall glass wall where the night outside showed nothing but darkness and the reflection of the bright room. He didn't drink the wine that sat in front of him. He didn't try to join the noisy conversations. He just sat, hands folded gently on the table, his gaze moving from one corner of the room to another, watching but never being seen. He could feel the eyes on him even when no one spoke to him. He could read lips, catch their expressions, and sense the hidden cruelty behind their polite faces. It wasn't the first time he had been treated like decoration. Like a body that filled a seat but not a voice that mattered. Whispers started small near the president's table, just a few words. Then they grew like smoke spreading through the air. One man leaned over and said something with a grin. The others laughed softly. They covered their mouths with napkins like children hiding secrets. The HOA president smirked without shame. He enjoyed it, and the people around him followed like shadows, laughing at a man who couldn't even hear them. Even the waiter avoided the corner where he sat, too scared to face the uncomfortable silence. The servers moved smoothly from table to table, their trays full of steak and sparkling drinks, but his table was always last, like a forgotten spot on a shining floor. One of the board members raised his glass and pointed at him when he thought the man wasn't looking. But the man saw it all. He didn't need sound to understand cruelty. He'd lived with it long enough to recognize it in a blink. Still, he kept calm, shoulders straight, fingers tapping lightly on the table. A quiet rhythm only he could hear in his head. He was not weak. He was patient. He was just waiting. In the corner near the service door stood a maid, a quiet woman with tired eyes and a soft face. Her hands were steady as she poured water and cleared plates. She worked for people who never remembered her name, but tonight she saw everything. She saw the way they looked at the deaf man, the way they whispered, the way they laughed. She saw the small pain in his stillness, the way he clenched his hands for just a second before forcing them to relax. She saw what others refused to. Her daughter, a little girl no one noticed, stood behind the long curtain that framed the stage, small hands gripping the fabric, eyes wide, quiet but sharp like a hawk watching the world. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was happening. She felt it, like cold air creeping into a warm room. She was used to being invisible too, just like him. The HOA president lifted his glass and tapped it with his ring. The sound echoed across the room, drawing everyone's attention to him. He loved moments like these, when all eyes turned his way and all heads tilted with fake respect. He began to talk, fast, smooth, the way people who love power always do. His lips moved with confidence. His hands moved like a conductor of a cheap orchestra. Every joke about how special the night was made people laugh louder. But when his gaze slid toward the deaf man, his lips twisted into a crueler shape. He said something about how some guests were quieter than others. The room roared with laughter. No one cared that the man could read lips. No one cared that cruelty was not invisible. They just laughed, louder and louder, because it was easy. But while they laughed, the deaf man lifted his eyes slowly, not with anger but with a kind of calm that felt dangerous. His eyes scanned the room like he was memorizing every face, every cruel smile, every arrogant grin. He saw them, really saw them, and deep down, something shifted in the room though no one else could feel it yet. His fingers stopped tapping. His back straightened just a little more. He sat like a storm, sitting quietly behind a wall of glass, waiting. The maid's daughter felt her heart race. She was only a child, but she understood what respect meant. She had watched her mother bow to people who never said thank you. She had watched the board members throw away good food while she and her mother went home hungry. She had learned to read faces like other children learn to read books, and the faces in that room were ugly, sharp, and cruel, her small body pressed against the curtain, the fabric scratching her arms. But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the man in the corner, and in that moment she felt something she couldn't name but would remember forever. The room sparkled, but it was a rotten sparkle. It was the shine of power built on looking down on others, the kind of shine that hides its cracks with gold. People kept eating and drinking, making plans about the deal they thought they owned. They didn't know that the quiet man they mocked wasn't just a guest. He was the one whose signature would make the billion-dollar deal real or make it disappear like smoke, but they were too busy laughing to see their own doom standing silently in the corner. The little girl stepped out from behind the curtain just a little. The chandelier light touched her cheek and made it glow softly, but no one noticed her yet. Everyone was too loud, too drunk on their own arrogance. The deaf man turned his head slightly. His eyes brushed past her face like a quiet spark. Something shifted between them, something silent but strong. The kind of thing no one in that room could understand, the kind of thing that could turn the night upside down in seconds. The maid saw it too. Her hands froze over the tray, the water glass trembling just a little. She felt like something was about to happen. Something big, something that would make these polished walls remember this night forever. The HOA board thought they controlled everything. But they were wrong. The most powerful thing in that room was not the president, not the rich homeowners, not the lawyers waiting in the back. It was the quiet man in the corner and the little girl behind the curtain. The only two who understood each other without a single word, and the HOA had no idea that their arrogance was about to blow up their biggest deal of the year. The whispers grew louder as the night went on, spreading through the room like smoke that no one could see but everyone could smell, the kind of whispers that weren't spoken to be kind, but to sting softly without leaving a mark. The HOA president leaned back in his chair, his suit shining under the chandelier light. His lips curved into a smirk as his fingers tapped his wine glass lazily. He liked this power, the kind where one glance could make people laugh on command. He turned his head toward the corner of the room where the deaf man sat alone, watching but silent, and with a tilt of his chin, one of the board members leaned closer to whisper something cruel. Their mouths moved quickly, smooth like people who enjoyed hurting others without using a single loud word. The man sitting next to him laughed behind his hand. Another woman covered her mouth with a napkin, but her shoulders shook with silent laughter. They thought their cruelty was invisible, but it wasn't. It hung in the room like a fog. The deaf man sat still, shoulders straight, his back like a wall that wouldn't break. His eyes didn't lower. They stayed calm but sharp. He saw their lips move, caught every cruel word they thought he couldn't understand. He saw their fake smiles, their tilted heads, their small gestures meant to humiliate quietly, but he didn't react, not because he didn't feel it, but because he knew who he was and they didn't. He had faced worse than whispers, worse than arrogant men who thought they owned rooms just because they wore suits and gold watches. Their smallness was loud even in silence, and he sat in it like a storm waiting behind a locked door. The president picked up his glass and tapped it again. A sharp sound that echoed like a tiny bell of arrogance. Everyone turned to him, eager like dogs waiting for a bone. He leaned forward, his grin wide now. His lips moved quickly as he told another joke at the expense of the quiet man, and the table exploded with laughter. Hands slammed lightly against the wood. Rings glittered, heads tilted back. No one noticed the maid by the wall holding a tray, her knuckles white against the metal. No one noticed how her daughter behind the curtain clenched her little hands. They were too busy laughing at a man they didn't understand. A board member with slick hair and an expensive watch mimicked the way the deaf man's hands moved earlier when he was signing to himself, twisting it into something ugly, making faces. Everyone around him laughed again, louder this time, like cruelty gave them strength. The waiter came to pour more wine but avoided looking at the man in the corner. The air around his table felt colder, like a quiet island in a storm of false joy, but the man didn't flinch. His fingers tapped the edge of the table again, steady, quiet, strong. The sound too soft to be heard but enough for him to keep his calm. He wasn't there to fight them, he was there to see. The maid caught his eyes for the first time and something in her chest twisted. She'd seen people like these board members all her life. people who laughed at those below them, people who believed respect was something bought with money. She had cleaned their houses, served their food, and swallowed her pride every day to survive. But seeing them mock a man who did nothing but sit quietly made her blood feel hot. Her daughter peeked from behind the curtain, her little heart pounding like a drum. She had learned to be quiet, to stay out of sight. But watching them laugh at him made something inside her burn like a small flame refusing to die. The president leaned closer to his friend, whispering again. The man next to him burst out laughing, wine spilling a little on the tablecloth, but no one cared. They pointed toward the corner now. Small gestures, mean gestures like children bullying someone who couldn't punch back, and yet their arrogance blinded them to who they were really mocking. They didn't know the man's name, didn't know his position, didn't know he was the one holding the pen that could sign the billion-dollar deal they were so proud of. They didn't know their laughter was digging their own grave. The deaf man watched them, his jaw tight now but his eyes calm. His gaze landed on the little girl behind the curtain for a second, and she froze, not from fear but from something else, something that made her want to step forward. The chandelier light glimmered against his eyes, and for a heartbeat the world felt quieter. The loud laughter turned into background noise, meaningless, like the buzzing of flies. The power in that room didn't belong to the people laughing. It was sitting silently, at a table near the glass wall, waiting for the right moment to move. The maid took a deep breath, her chest rising slowly as she placed the tray down. She couldn't speak out loud. She couldn't stop the board, but she also couldn't ignore what she saw. Her daughter's little eyes locked on the man's face like she already understood something big was about to happen. She wasn't like the people in that room. She didn't see money, suits, or titles. She saw a man being hurt, and something inside her small heart was ready to stand up. The laughter grew louder again, like a storm peaking before it breaks. Someone slammed their hand against the table. A woman leaned back, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. The president raised his glass like he'd already won, like the night was his, like the deal was already in his pocket. He didn't know the night wasn't his anymore. The real power sat quietly and listened to their cruelty like a judge at the end of a trial. They thought they were mocking someone weak, but they were really showing the world how small they were. The maid's daughter took one step out from behind the curtain, quiet as a breath. The chandelier light brushed against her cheek, and the deaf man lifted his eyes again. Their gazes met, silent but strong. A spark of understanding passed between them, and though the board didn't know it, the night had already shifted. The game they thought they controlled was no longer theirs. Their cruel laughter was about to turn into stunned silence, and none of them could see it coming. The maid's daughter pressed her small hands against the thick curtain, her heartbeat echoing in her ears like drums. The world around her felt too big, too loud, and yet she could see everything the adults pretended not to notice. Her eyes followed every cruel smirk, every pointing finger, every silent laugh aimed at the man in the corner. She had grown up in this building, hiding in corners while her mother cleaned floors, polished glasses, and served people who never once remembered her name. She had learned to be quiet, to blend into the background like wallpaper. But tonight, something was different. Something in the way the man sat alone with quiet strength pulled her forward, like a thread pulling a kite through the wind. She could not look away. Her little chest burned with something new, something fierce. She didn't have money or power or a name that mattered to these people, but she had something. They didn't. She understood what it meant to be invisible. She watched the deaf man's fingers move gently against the table, tapping, tracing, signing small shapes to himself like someone holding on to a language that no one else could hear. It was quiet but beautiful, and she understood it, not perfectly, but enough, because a teacher once came to her school and taught sign language to the poor kids who sat in the back of the class. She remembered every curve, every movement of the hand. She remembered how proud she felt when she learned to say hello. With her fingers, how it made her feel like she could speak to someone the world refused to listen to. And now that language was right in front of her, glowing quietly in a sea of arrogance. Her small fingers curled tighter around the curtain. She wanted to step out, to talk to him. But the room was full of giants, not the kind that lived in stories, but the kind who wore suits and gold watches and thought they owned everything they touched. They were loud even in their silence, their power pressing down like heavy air. But then she saw him look up, just for a moment. His eyes found hers like a light in the dark, and that tiny look burned through all her fear. It wasn't a plea for help, it wasn't pity, it was something stronger, like he was telling her without a single sound. I see you too. The chandelier light poured over the room like melted gold, making everything shine fake and bright, but she saw through it. The president leaned closer to his friends again, their lips moving like snakes hissing, their laughter spilling out again like dirty water. They thought they were safe, untouchable. They thought no one could break their circle. They didn't even see her. To them she didn't exist, and maybe that was their mistake, because invisible people were the ones who saw everything, every weakness, every crack behind their polished walls. She took a slow breath, her tiny chest rising and falling as she stepped one foot forward. Her shoes made no sound on the marble floor. The curtains slid off her shoulder. Her dark hair brushed against her cheeks. She moved carefully, not like a child sneaking but like someone walking into something she already knew she had to do. She didn't know what would happen. She just knew she couldn't stay hidden anymore. The air around the room felt colder near the man's table. Not because of him, but because of the way everyone had turned it into a cage without bars. And she was done watching. The maid turned and froze when she saw her daughter stepping out. Her hands tightened on the tray until her knuckles turned white. Fear rushed through her body like cold wind, because she knew what these people could do when someone without power stood in their way. But there was something unshakable in her little girl's eyes, something she had never seen before. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't fear, it was quiet courage, the kind that didn't need to shout, the kind that didn't ask permission. The girl walked closer to the table, step after step, and for the first time, someone was moving toward the man in the corner instead of away from him. The board members barely noticed at first, too busy drowning in their own laughter, but the deaf man saw her, his eyes following her small figure like a silent lighthouse cutting through fog. She stopped near his chair, the golden light pooling on her hair. She tilted her head just a little, her hands slowly rising up, every movement uncertain, but full of heart. Her fingers began to shape the signs she remembered, soft, hesitant, but real. And the room around them blurred into something distant, like the noise was fading. His eyes widened, not with shock but with something warmer, something that had been locked away behind quiet walls for too long. He signed back, slowly at first, testing if she really understood, and she did, maybe not perfectly, but enough to make a bridge where everyone else built walls. The chandelier sparkled, the laughter still rang somewhere in the background, but between the two of them, silence felt louder, alive. Some of the board members finally noticed. Their laughter faltered just a little. Their heads tilted like confused predators seeing something they couldn't mock because they didn't understand it. The president's grin flickered, his eyes narrowing when he saw a maid's child standing near his most powerful guest. He didn't like it. He didn't like anything he couldn't control, but he didn't move yet, because arrogance makes people slow. It makes them believe nothing can touch them. The girl's hands kept moving, her small fingers trembling but refusing to stop. She told him simple things, asked if he was okay, told him she could understand, told him he wasn't alone. And those tiny signs were louder than every expensive speech given in that room, louder than every fake smile. The deaf man's shoulders lowered. A breath he didn't know he'd been holding slipped out of him like a soft wave. His lips curled, not in a big smile but in something real, something the room hadn't seen all night. The maid's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, pride and fear mixing together like fire and water. She didn't know what her daughter had just stepped into, but deep inside, she knew something had changed, not just for the man or for the little girl, but for everyone in that shining, rotten room. The board members had spent the night laughing at silence, but now silence had a voice, and it came from the smallest person in the room. The chandelier lights flickered softly as if the room itself felt the shift in the air. The laughter that had filled every corner of the banquet hall slowly began to lose its weight, like a storm beginning to die down. The little maid's daughter stood beside the deaf man's table, small hands trembling just enough to show her fear, but her eyes steady like someone who had made a choice they wouldn't step back from. She raised her hands a little higher, letting the light fall over her fingers as she shaped the signs slowly, carefully. Her fingers moved with the soft rhythm of someone who was not trying to impress anyone, only to be heard in the quiet way that most people in this room never understood. The deaf man's gaze locked on her hands as if the rest of the room didn't exist anymore. His eyes were tired when he came in, but now, something alive had returned, something quiet but strong. The board members noticed it one by one. The way predators notice something moving in their territory. Their laughter thinned, their smiles cracked, their forks stopped midair. They didn't understand what she was doing, but they saw the way the man's posture changed, the way his head lifted, the way his chest rose like he could breathe again, and that alone unsettled them because power was supposed to belong to them, not to a child of a maid who wasn't even supposed to be seen. The president shifted in his chair, a sour line cutting through his fake smile, his fingers drumming against his glass as if trying to remind the room who he thought was in control. But control was already slipping, soft and silent, like sand sliding through fingers. The girl signed again, this time a little faster, her confidence growing with every movement. She told him she understood a little. She told him she saw what they did. She asked if he was okay, and he replied with trembling hands, fast at first, then slower when he realized she could keep up. She translated his world with her eyes, not for the room but for him, and for the first time that night, the man who had been treated like a shadow felt seen. The chandelier light painted them in a soft, golden glow that made the rest of the room feel smaller, like a stage shrinking around two real people while the others faded into a blurry crowd. The maid, still holding the tray against her chest, could barely breathe as she watched her daughter stand in the center of everything that was never meant to belong to them. She had spent years bowing her head to the people at those tables, calling them sir and ma'am while pretending not to hear their cruelty. But her little girl had walked straight into their world without fear, and somehow, it made the room that used to crush her feel weaker. She saw the president lean toward one of the board members, his lips moving fast, his eyes sharp with annoyance, and she knew they were talking about getting the girl out. But none of them moved, because something in the man's gaze had changed too. His silence was no longer something they could step on, it was something standing tall. The man placed his hand softly over the edge of the table and signed something that made the girl's face light up. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile too big, but her eyes shone like a spark. She signed back, repeating his words to make sure she understood, and when he nodded, her small shoulders straightened. The room was watching now. No one was laughing anymore. They were caught between confusion and something they couldn't name. It wasn't just sign language. It was power moving quietly through the room like a current. The president cleared his throat loudly, trying to break the spell, but the sound was weak. No one cheered. No one laughed. The wine glasses sat forgotten. The expensive meal untouched, because something as simple as a child signing had ripped through their arrogance like a knife through silk. The girl didn't even look at him. She only looked at the man, her hands dancing slowly in the air, building a bridge the rest of them could never walk on, because they didn't know how to listen. The deaf man leaned forward slightly, his hands moving quickly, sharp, confident, and the girl translated each word with her eyes wide. His lips parted in a breath, and then something they hadn't seen all night happened. A smile, small but real, curled on his face. The kind of smile that doesn't belong to people who are broken, but to people who finally feel free. The room froze in that moment, because their laughter, their whispers, their expensive suits, all of it meant nothing compared to the quiet power of one gesture. The president shifted again, his hand tightening on the edge of the table, his ego cracking like thin glass. He didn't like losing control, especially not to someone he mocked, and definitely not to a maid's daughter. But there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do, because whatever language they were speaking didn't belong to him, and for the first time he wasn't the one who decided what happened in this room, the deaf man was. The chandelier shimmered softly. The air felt different now, heavier for some, lighter for others. The maid's daughter lowered her hands slowly, their eyes still locked, and the man gave a single nod, silent but powerful, and in that moment, every person in the room who had laughed without thinking felt a flicker of something they hadn't expected: shame. The kind that burns even through expensive suits and fake smiles. The kind they couldn't laugh away, and it all began with one little girl's gesture, a single sign that was louder than their entire night. The chandelier lights burned brighter as the night reached its peak, but the warmth that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp like a blade pressed against pride. The board members shifted uneasily in their seats, their fake laughter swallowed up by a silence they didn't understand, their eyes flicking between the deaf man and the little girl standing beside him, her small hands still trembling slightly from the courage she had pulled out of nowhere. But they Fire in her eyes refused to die. The deaf man leaned forward, his back straight now, no longer sitting in the corner like a shadow, but like someone who owned the very air they were breathing. His hands moved with calm precision as he began to sign again, and the girl, though young, spoke every word he shaped with a clear, steady voice that echoed through the entire hall like a drumbeat no one could ignore. "He says," she started, her voice firm, her small chest rising and falling as she spoke. Each word. "He came here to give this community a future, not to be their joke." A hush fell so thick over the banquet that even the clinking of glasses seemed afraid to exist. The board members froze. One man coughed nervously. Another woman tried to adjust her pearl necklace as if it could hide her shame, but nothing could cover the way the air itself felt heavier now. The little girl's voice, though soft, carried more power than all their speeches combined. The president stiffened in his seat, a vein pulsing at the side of his temple as he forced a grin that no longer worked on anyone. His fingers tightened on the stem of his glass, trying to hold onto a control that had already slipped through his hands like sand. The deaf man's hands moved again, sharp and deliberate, his expression unreadable but strong. The girl translated without a pause. "He says he owns the land your project needs, and he came tonight to give his signature." The room collectively inhaled, a sound like wind sucking through cracks. But respect is the first thing he looks for, not the last. Someone at the board table shifted in panic, their chair screeching softly against the marble floor, but no one spoke. They all stared like they were finally seeing the man they had mocked, not as decoration but as the one person who could destroy everything they had built. The president forced a laugh, hollow and shaking. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his fake charm dripping like spoiled honey. "Come on, it's just a misunderstanding." His lips moved carefully, but the deaf man didn't need to hear the words to understand their weight. The man's smile was weak, and everyone could see it. It wasn't control anymore. It was desperation dressed in a suit. The girl looked at him, then back at the deaf man, her hands curling slightly at her sides. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was the voice that held the room together, the bridge between silence and power, and she didn't look away. The deaf man signed again, faster now, no longer soft or unsure, but with the authority of someone who had made a decision long before this night began. The girl lifted her chin and repeated his words clearly. "He says your disrespect speaks louder than your offer." A wave of tension moved through the room like a storm wind. "He says he doesn't sign deals with people who treat others like dirt." A board member gasped audibly. Someone else whispered a name in panic. One investor grabbed their phone from the table, already sensing the disaster before it struck. The president's grin fell completely, replaced by the pale, tight look of a man who suddenly realized the world was no longer on his side. The girl's voice shook a little now, not because she was afraid, but because of the weight of what she was saying. She had never spoken like this in her life, never stood in front of so many powerful people, never carried someone else's voice on her small shoulders, but she stood taller than any of them at that moment. "He says," she continued, swallowing her nerves like a soldier swallowing pain, "the deal is off." Those words didn't just hang in the air. They slammed into the room like a hammer on glass, cracking everything they had built with their arrogance. One of the lawyers sitting near the end of the table jumped to their feet, face red, stuttering about contracts and opportunities. But the deaf man didn't even glance at him. His silence was louder than their panic. The president's hands shook slightly, but he tried to cover it by pressing them together on the table. "Wait." His lips moved again, slower this time, but the man didn't care anymore. His calm was the kind that only people with real power carried, the kind of calm that made others shake. The chandelier light glimmered against the deaf man's suit, making him look like the only solid thing in a room full of people crumbling under their own weight. The girl took a deep breath and finished translating the last thing he signed. "He says he's giving the deal to someone who understands respect, not people who hide cruelty behind smiles." The maid standing at the edge of the room covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and pride at her daughter. No one clapped, no one dared move, because they all knew this was the moment everything broke. The investors who had been sitting quietly began whispering urgently, some already standing to leave. The president tried to rise too, but his knees betrayed him, weak and stiff. He had built this night on arrogance, believing the man in the corner was powerless, and now that same man had flipped the table without raising his voice, without shouting, without even needing to hear their excuses. The silence grew so heavy it almost pressed against the walls, and the little girl, the one they didn't even know existed before tonight, stood at the center of it like the spark that lit the fire. The deaf man slowly pushed his chair back, stood up, adjusted his coat with quiet dignity, and gave the little girl a small nod that spoke more than any word could. She nodded back, her hands still trembling but her heart steady. The president watched, helpless, as the most important deal of his career walked out of the room, not with noise or anger but with silence that burned deeper than any insult. And he finally understood too late what everyone in that room felt but couldn't say. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it moves in silence and takes everything with it. The room that once glowed with power now carried the weight of panic that no chandelier light could hide. The president sat frozen in his seat as whispers turned to sharp breaths. The board members who had spent the night laughing now stared at each other with pale faces, their polished arrogance cracked like cheap glass. The investors who had once leaned back comfortably were now on the edge of their chairs, phones in hand, eyes darting to the deaf man who was already standing like a storm that had finally reached land. The silence around him was not weak, it was heavy, the kind of silence that makes people realize they no longer control the room, and it squeezed every bit of fake power out of their expensive suits, their fake smiles, their rehearsed voices. The president tried to clear his throat, but his own voice stuck like a stone at the back of it. The deaf man didn't shout, didn't point fingers, didn't even raise his hands in anger. He simply stood there with a quiet power that made the entire board seem small. His eyes moved slowly across their faces, one by one, as if memorizing the faces of people who thought mockery was power. The little maid's daughter stood beside him, small but unshakable, her hands curled into nervous fists against her dress, but her head high because she knew this wasn't a game anymore. She had become the voice of the man they mocked, and in doing so, she had changed everything. The maid watched from the edge of the hall, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it filled the room, pride and fear mixing together in a way she had never felt before. The president finally pushed himself up from the chair, slow and shaky, his face trying to rebuild the mask of calm that had already shattered. He stepped forward, hands spread wide in a desperate attempt to look in control. His lips moved fast, words tumbling out like dry leaves. But the man didn't care to look at him anymore. The president's voice, once sharp and commanding, now sounded like noise in the wind. The girl turned slightly, watching the president with the quiet, steady gaze of someone who no longer feared the giants she grew up serving. The investors leaned back, some of them already shaking, their heads, others texting under the table, their billion-dollar trust in the HOA melting like wax under heat. The president tried to smile again, but his jaw twitched, sweat gathered at the side of his forehead. He leaned toward the deaf man, speaking slowly, his hands waving like he was begging for reason. But the man simply lifted his hands slightly, a clean, calm gesture that made everyone stop breathing for a second. Then he signed something short, final, his movements sharp as a blade, and the little girl's voice rose softly, steady and clear, cutting through the tense air like a bell. He says, "Your apology doesn't buy respect." The words sank into the floor like stones dropping into deep water. No one dared laugh. No one dared interrupt. Point one of the lawyers jumped up again. A thin man with shaky hands, his papers crumpled. He started talking about legal obligations, contracts, timelines, but he might as well have been talking to the walls because the deaf man's eyes never moved. From the president, the lawyer's voice cracked mid-sentence when he realized no one in the room, not even the investors, believed the HOA had control anymore. The deaf man signed again, a little faster now, as if to close the book on everything, and the girl translated with a voice that was soft but final. He says the deal is already gone. The sound of a fork dropping to the floor echoed like a gunshot in the quiet hall. One woman covered her mouth. Another pressed her palm to her forehead. The president blinked rapidly, trying to process the fact that the power he thought he owned wasn't his anymore. It never was. It had always belonged to the man he mocked, the one who sat in silence, waiting, watching, and then struck without raising his voice. The little girl looked up at the man, her eyes wide but steady, and he gave her the faintest nod, a quiet thank you that meant more than anything those board members had said all night. Investors began to stand, one by one, without a word. The shuffling of chairs was louder than their earlier laughter. The president called out to them, lips moving too fast to make sense, his hands shaking, his smile dying completely. He looked like a man watching a castle he built from sand collapse under a wave he didn't see coming. One of the investors walked past him without even turning. Their head, the weight of the man's silence, followed them out the door like a shadow that couldn't be escaped. The girl stood next to him, small but strong, her mother's eyes burning with pride in the corner of the hall. The president finally sagged into his chair again, his head low, his knuckles white against the table, and the people who once laughed with him now leaned away like he carried the ruin they were all trying to escape. No one dared speak. No one dared blame the girl, because deep down, they knew it wasn't her who destroyed the night. It was their own arrogance. The deaf man turned toward the door, his movements slow and calm like someone who didn't need to rush because the world already moved for him. The girl followed him with her eyes, and when he reached the door, he paused, looking back at the room that had mocked him only an hour ago, and now couldn't even look him in the eye. The chandelier light caught his suit, turning him into the only thing that shone with dignity in a place full of shattered pride. He gave one last nod to the girl, and she nodded back like a soldier who had just stood through a storm she was never meant to face, and then he walked out, leaving behind a room that would never forget the silence that destroyed them. The night ended with no applause, no celebration, no clinking of glasses like the board had imagined. The banquet hall that once roared with arrogant laughter now sat in a deep, heavy silence that wrapped around every wall like a cold fog. The golden lights from the chandelier still shone, but they no longer made the room look grand. They only made the cracks in the people sitting beneath them more visible. The president sat hunched over in his chair like a man who had just watched his entire kingdom fall without a single blow being thrown. His expensive suit looked too tight. His hands gripped the table like holding onto wood could bring the night back, but nothing would. The deal was gone, the power was gone, the respect he thought he commanded had turned to dust in front of his eyes, and all it took was silence, truth, and the hands of a little girl they hadn't even seen when the night began. The maid stood at the edge of the room, the tray still in her shaking hands, but it was no longer from fear. It was from a storm of feelings she couldn't fully name. Pride burned through her chest like fire, pride in the child who had stepped forward when even the adults bowed their heads, pride in the courage that came from nowhere but her heart. The same little girl who grew up walking behind her quietly had stood in the center of the richest people in the community and made them all look small without shouting once. The other staff members whispered softly to each other, their voices low, their eyes wide, because they had seen something no one in that room would ever forget. The board members didn't dare meet each other's eyes. They were used to being the ones who decided what happened to others. They were used to mocking quietly and getting away with it. But now their faces were red, their throats dry, their power cut away by the very man they called decoration. They shifted in their chairs like children caught doing something cruel. One woman tried to fix her necklace. Another man coughed into his hand to fill the silence, but nothing worked. Shame has a way of sitting heavier than words, and tonight it sat on their shoulders like a weight they couldn't hide from. The president finally leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands, his arrogance crushed into quiet panic. He had spent years believing that money made him untouchable, but he'd never felt smaller than he did at that moment. The night that was supposed to make him the hero of the community had turned him into the man who lost everything, not to another powerful man, but to his own mockery, his own ego, his own mistake, and in the corner of his mind he saw the deaf man's calm face as he walked out. That quiet nod that burned more than any insult ever could. The little maid's daughter stood still, her small hands pressed against her dress, her breathing fast but steady. She didn't fully understand the numbers, the contracts, the billion-dollar deals they kept talking about, but she understood one thing better than anyone in that room. Kindness has a strength no arrogance can crush. She hadn't planned to speak, hadn't planned to stand up, but her heart refused to let cruelty be the only language spoken that night, and now, though she was just a child, she had shifted the weight of an entire deal without even knowing it. The president could no longer hide behind fake smiles, and the board could no longer pretend their cruelty was invisible. The maid slowly walked toward her daughter, her steps soft against the marble floor. The board members turned their faces away, too ashamed to look at the two people they once ignored like shadows. The president lowered his head when she passed his table, a man who thought he owned the night now bowing in silence without even realizing it. The maid knelt down and wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tightly like she was holding onto the brightest thing left in the room. Her voice trembled against her child's ear as she whispered, "I'm proud of you." And the little girl smiled softly, not fully understanding the weight of what she had done but feeling the warmth in her mother's arms. At the far end of the room, the glass doors, where the deaf man had left, still swung slightly, the night air slipping in like a quiet reminder of what had just happened. The power had walked out of the room and wasn't coming back. Investors had left without a glance. Lawyers had dropped their files on the table, and the board sat like broken statues, no one daring to speak the truth out loud, but everyone feeling it burn under their skin. They hadn't just lost money, they had lost their image, their fake strength, their carefully built tower of lies. The maid stood with her daughter at the center of the hall, and for the first time since she had started working there, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like she had to keep her head down. She had watched people with money bend, not to her, not to her daughter, but to something they couldn't buy or control: respect. She turned toward the door with her daughter's hand in hers, and as they walked out, the room that once made her feel invisible now felt powerless, empty, hollow. The president stared at the chandelier as if the light could somehow erase the memory of what had happened. But he knew it never would. This was the night people would whisper about for years, the night the man they mocked walked away, the night their power crumbled without a fight, and the night a maid's daughter spoke with her hands and became the loudest voice in the room. And somewhere outside, under the quiet night sky, the deaf man walked away with a calm heart, leaving behind not just a failed deal, but a lesson that would haunt the arrogant for a very long time.